Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Given that there's competition over in Rackham, I think you made the right choice by coming here. I'm Margaret Hedstrom. I'm the interim director of the Museum Studies program. And every year, the Museum Studies program brings a visiting scholar to campus to interact for a week during the winter semester to engage with students, faculty, the museum community, and the public. This year, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Samuel Redman, author of the award-winning book, Bone Rooms, From Scientific Racism to Human Prehistory in Museums, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to also thank our co-sponsors for their outpouring of support. I think indicative of the broad appeal of Dr. Redman's work, the co-sponsors for this year's Visiting Scholar include the Program in Science, Technology, and Society, known as STS, the Program in Science, Technology, and Public Policy, STPP, the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, and the Museum of Natural History, opening soon in its new facility in less than a month. We thank you for your support. Sam Redman is a historian who earned a PhD in American history from University of California at Berkeley and is an associate professor of history at University of Massachusetts Amherst. His interest in museums early in his career led him to positions in several museums, including the Field Museum of Natural History, History Colorado, and the Science Museum of Minnesota. And as I understand it, became the inspiration for his dissertation and his book, Bone Rooms. Sam is a multifaceted historian, my favorite kind, who has led several oral history projects, including the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront Oral History Project, the Japanese American Confinement Sites Oral History Project, and an oral history project documenting the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. At UMass, he teaches courses on US history and oral history, public history, and museums and historical site interpretation, and he runs the Oral History Lab. This evening, he will talk about his next book on the legacies of salvage anthropology and US museums, raising questions for museums everywhere and for society about the vast collections of material culture objects and human remains whose ownership, value, interpretation, and destiny are as contested today as they've ever been. So join me in welcoming Sam for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to begin tonight by thanking the University of Michigan, the Museum Studies program, and all of the co-sponsors who made my visit here possible this week. I feel a little out of place when I look at the roster of individuals that have served as visiting scholar. It is incredibly remarkable. It's sort of a who's who of people in the museum field over the last decade. And so I feel like this is a huge honor for me at this stage in my career, and I'm really, I feel a great sense of privilege for being here. So I hope that in response to this sort of inadequacy, I can at least spark a conversation where we can think about some of the issues that we've been talking and thinking about all week in museum studies, but for those that are here tonight, we can think about some of these issues maybe for the first time. Gunshots ripped through the late spring air near a dusty U.S. Army outpost in rural Minnesota in May 1864. The two militiamen were engaged in a campaign were taking part in a campaign against local Indians, and they shot a Dakota man twice. One bullet struck him in the head, and the second bullet tore through either his mouth or neck. Either wound alone would have been fatal, most likely. The scene must have been pretty ugly and dramatic. The man likely died instantly or bled to death in mere minutes. Healthy and strong in life, he now lay on the ground, completely disfigured. Described in contemporary newspaper accounts as a, quote, hostile Sioux, and by later scientists as a man of distant Asiatic descent, he was probably between 25 and 35 years old when he died. In other words, he was roughly my age. A single incident such as this, even a deadly one, on the distant Minnesota frontier might have soon vanished from the collective national memory in a nation focused on other violent clashes with Native Americans across the American West, or the raging Civil War happening to the east and further south. But what happened to this man's body after his death was striking. This man's earthly remains were about to play a small part in an unfolding drama that involved major museums, obsessive and sometimes eccentric scientists, and an array of amateur collectors. It's a story, a complex story that's marked by evolving efforts to understand the human body in the language of race and human history. These efforts sometimes clashed, competed, and even overlapped in complex ways. Hardly a single isolated incident, thousands, if not millions, of highly sensitive, sacred material culture artifacts and human remains, numbering nearly 500,000 Native American individuals, were collected for museums in the United States. This leaves behind complex problems for museums to wrestle with in our present world. This talk explores themes that are present in my first two book projects, Bone Rooms from Scientific Racism to Human Prehistory in Museums, published in 2016, explores how human remains became these highly coveted objects for scientific and pseudoscientific research and display. Later, human remains continued to be collected and exhibited in museums, but with different and evolving contexts than before. And this book examines the era between the late 19th century and the early 20th century when human bones were collected with the most intensity and fervor. The story in Bone Rooms centers on how efforts to construct racial difference really become central in the story of bone collecting, and how major new exhibitions on human evolution pushed some earlier displays off the center stage. My second book project, tentatively entitled Prophets and Ghosts, A History of Salvage Anthropology, further explores how the salvage anthropology movement, and I see it as just that, a movement, pushed collectors of all kinds to gather objects and artifacts, including human remains and other sacred objects, in what was perceived to be crisis situations. So a fundamental question in my research is actually quite simple. And that is, how and why did hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of objects from around the world end up in US museums? Why are Native cultures especially strongly represented in these collections? And why do these materials reflect certain kinds of biases reflective of their collectors? It turns out that some of these seemingly pretty simple questions, how did this stuff get here, requires a pretty complicated or multi-layered answer. One current of thought that I find an undertold level of significance is the influence of cultural salvage efforts on museum history. Salvage anthropology, as it emerged in the late 19th century, or in the 19th century rather, emphasized rescuing and preserving apparently threatened material culture objects, linguistic information, language and song recorded on audio, and even resulted in the creation of many other depictions of indigenous people, especially from pencil sketches to paintings, photographs, the early use of photography in ethnographic work, and even the use of this brand new technology of the moving picture. So the salvage anthropology effort was vast and complex, with tangled legacies and deep implications for museums and indigenous peoples today. So my new book's provisional argument is that what scholars sometimes call salvage anthropology represents this much more diverse, deeper, and longer lasting influence in American thought and science than is commonly understood. I argue that these threads, establishing human remains collections at museums in the United States, and the deep and lingering influence of salvage anthropology as a line of thought, really work to shape contours of and facilitate, in some ways, the dramatic growth of museum collections as we know them today. A lot of this takes place from about the time of the Civil War, stretching all the way up through well into the 20th century. I argue that an evolving network of scholars, scientists, and importantly, amateurs contributed in meaningful ways and in still controversial ways to the care, repair, and stewardship of culture in North America. The network of individuals connected to the story includes not just the anthropologists and archaeologists and museum curators that we may know, but also US Army officers and missionaries and fur traders, many, many others. The story sometimes, in fact, often takes really surprising turns, like the fact that Francis Densmore, who is known almost exclusively in the available literature as a pioneering ethnomusicologist, also collected human remains. One of the major arguments here is in the book on salvage anthropology is reflected in the nature of this idea, also in my first book, the notion that many more people contribute to the story than how we commonly understand it. The sort of same names that come up again and again are important, no doubt important contributors to the story, but you don't have a massive, almost industrial scale of collecting human remains unless you have the collectors of many different kinds working, in this case, all around the world, sending these collections back to major museums. When exploring the museum archives, this almost becomes screamingly clear that so many individuals contributed to the growth of these collections, and really it bursts so far beyond the names that are repeated over and over again in the available literature. So Densmore, in September of 1918, while working in the field collecting songs and stories, discovers several human remains that are exposed due to a recent flood and flooding near a riverbank in Minnesota. And she collects them because she says, in her view, that this was too interesting an opportunity to slight. Besides, she remarked, the material was being picked up by those who would never make any use of it. Similarly, Indian agents, missionaries, military officers, and many, many others contributed to this effort to collect, locate, and ship materials that they believe best expressed, quote, authentic traditions of threatened societies. Well, the methodological approaches here do change a lot over time, if you can even consider whether or not they share, the people that are engaging in this, share any sort of commonality, really, in terms of the methodological approaches. I argue that while that change over time is consequential, the consistency and the longevity of this project, the fact that it goes many decades and over several different generations, it is in fact more consequential to this story. In other words, the story of salvage anthropology in the United States is as much about continuity as it is about change. Federal agencies, especially the Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian Institution, and later the National Park Service, all loomed really large in shaping and facilitating the work that was happening in this arena. So my new project seeks to demonstrate that a particular discourse connecting to museums and collections was shaped by this impending sense of cultural decay in the face of breathless modernity, especially in connection when thinking about indigenous populations in the Americas and beyond. This discourse really begins early. You can reach very far back into the annals of people writing about Native Americans or Europeans writing about Native Americans to see that this starts to appear in sort of the rhetoric as early as the 16th, 17th century. But it certainly becomes much more intense by the middle of the 19th century. Here's a catalog card from the Army Medical Museum collection, now at the Smithsonian Institution. In the days following the lone Dakota man's death, one German-American newspaper reported on the skirmish from the settlers' perspective. The paper proclaimed, quote, "It is time to hunt down these red beasts with iron pursuit." Newspapers crowed about the small victory over Native Americans, but the incident did not settle the tensions that had boiled over just 2 years earlier in the bloody 1862 Dakota War. In this context, the single violent encounter, again, it wouldn't have stood out, and the man's grave might have been forgotten. But only a few months after the Dakota man's death, his skeleton was quietly removed from the ground. The bones were brought to a military doctor stationed at the fort, who carefully laid them out on a makeshift wooden operating table. The acting assistant surgeon, a measured and experienced man named Alfred Mueller, lamented the circumstances surrounding the young Native American man's death and mutilation, and in a careful hand, he wrote a letter that described the body as having experienced, quote, "unnecessary ill treatment." Mueller no doubt possessed some of his own vivid memories, violent memories, traumatic memories related to violence that was happening near him in the American West. Just a few years earlier, he had received high praise from the Army and in newspaper accounts for treating wounded settlers following one particularly grisly attack. But despite his firsthand experience with frontier violence, he found the recent beating of the corpse of the American Indian man in question utterly deplorable. But for Mueller, what was done was done. With the bones now laid out before him, he delicately handled and examined each one, steadily writing out his own detailed notes about the body. The smell of the body was different now, earthier. Bones were indeed badly cut and damaged in places. However, many of the individual bones had been pretty much spared injury, and Mueller was fascinated. So despite his feelings about the treatment of the corpse, Mueller did not rebury the body after his examination. Instead, he boxed the remains and he sent them to Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Army had recently opened a museum, a medical museum. And Mueller believed that the skeleton might be useful for scientific endeavors that had been described in a museum catalog that he had read. And several weeks later, he wrote another letter to the Army Medical Museum saying that he was sending them another package, and this contained the man's missing hand, which Mueller had managed to procure from some unnamed source in the name of science. If you're wondering, geez, the Army Medical Museum was in Ford's Theater starting in 1866. Yes, that Ford's Theater. And it must have been a pretty amazing, remarkable experience to walk through this former theater building where President Lincoln had just been assassinated. The remains, though, from the Army Medical Museum were eventually swept up into this larger project, really sparking the creation of a physical anthropology program at the Smithsonian. There was really a changing kaleidoscope of ideas related to the human body and race, human origins and prehistory. The scientists are eager at this moment to study these ideas, and they begin organizing spaces that are colloquially known as bone rooms. And in these spaces, they study the bones in an effort, often in this era, to classify races and develop, gradually, increasingly develop a better understanding of the deeper human past. And again, they really rely on collectors of all kinds. And these collectors, it's difficult then to really generalize what their motivations might be. There are certainly some commonalities, but it's also clear that people with many different ideas, sometimes competing ideas, are also collecting human remains and other types of sacred objects and sending them to museums. It's a difficult problem for a historian then to parse out some of these individual motivations. Museums that were concerned with natural history, with medicine, with anthropology, in their quest to solve riddles connected to race and human history, all turn to human remains for answers. And starting around the time of the Civil War, stretching deep into the 20th century, this actually becomes a pretty common pursuit. And it's not limited to professional collectors, but several key major collectors appear again and again, and they also coordinate, sometimes from the position of an important curator position or a museum director position, the building up of these museums. What's interesting, if you look at the historical sources, especially newspapers and magazines, but also internal museum documents, there's this really remarkable contradiction that emerges. And that is that museum directors in this era are convinced that if they do any sort of display like this, of put on a human remains on exhibition, the public will be utterly mortified and so angry as to potentially lead to the shutting down of the museum. When in fact, quite repeatedly, something quite different takes place, and that is when these remains do go on display in certain instances at fairs, at medical museums, natural history museums, and in other contexts, they tend to be remarkably popular. Many people are attracted to these exhibitions. And this sort of process then creates this cycle where more and more bones are enabled to be collected. And bones are often sent to museums unsolicited. So people are aware of this phenomenon, but they're not going out into the world necessarily with a charge to collect human remains, so much so as they happen across remains, like Francis Densmore. People are clear in some of their letters that they are engaging in sort of random looting and grave robbing, or that they have been given, it's quite common in fact that people, this is a weird sort of thing. I'm glad my parents didn't leave me any dead bodies personally, but it appears again and again in the archives that people will say, my dad had this creepy skull on his mantle for 40 years, and it creeps me the heck out, and I want to get rid of it, and I would like to donate it to the museum. That's remarkably common. So some, though, are removed from the ground with far more systematic intent, carefully removed from cemeteries or other archaeological sites, as that field is increasingly professionalizing over the same era. So the gradual, piecemeal, and sometimes haphazard acquisition of human remains and subsequent attempts to draw out important ideas from their studies eventually develops into this outright competition to fill bone rooms with specimens. The desire for scientific collections and the connection to competing ideas about race and human history really help fuel this. The collections generally outgrow storage areas and begin spilling into hallways and occasionally onto gallery floors in exhibitions like this one. The physicians and anatomists who come of age during the Civil War are keenly aware of these efforts to collect human skeletons and other preserved body parts. Some sought out the chance. They intentionally put themselves in the position to try to be involved in these projects themselves. And those involved disagreed on how best to categorize the races, how to care for bodies once they were in museums, and how to understand these individuals within this larger tapestry of human history. So they disagreed on a huge number of points, but they inherently agreed on the value. They shared this collective agreement on the value overall of building bone rooms. So packages that are accompanied with letters, often attached to them, many of them with stories like Alfred Mueller's, arrived almost daily at the Smithsonian Institution, the Army Medical, earlier the Army Medical Museum, from the American West, especially, and over time, over expeditions that are happening around the globe. After arriving in Washington, D.C., the Dakota Man's remains were put on display at the Army Medical Museum, though details about any possible exhibition are quite murky. But the skeleton was most likely used as a stand-in to teach visitors about this field of comparative anatomy and intended to represent all Native Americans, not just a Dakota individual. In some instances, bones, in fact, were presumed to be similar enough that they could simply be interchangeable within racial categories. So if a jaw of a Native American man that was on display was too broken or shattered for the display, the museum could simply swap out the broken or missing bone with another similarly sized Native American skeleton. Historians and other scholars have described the late 19th century as the museum age, or the golden age for museum building in the United States. In considering how material culture collections came together, salvage becomes this really remarkable animating force, but other cultural forces, of course, are at play here. Urban expansion, colonialism, and the professionalization of the sciences are also deeply at play. Alice Erdlichka, who's about as nice of a guy to hang out with, I suspect, as this picture suggests, he writes a letter in 1913 helping us connect some of these dots. He is the first curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, at least insofar as amassing a huge and diverse number of human remains. Erdlichka is really a tour de force. He's incredibly controversial, even within his own field. Over time, people think of his ideas as increasingly out of date. He is influenced by Lamarck and eugenics in an era where more and more people are adopting to Darwinian thinking. So he's just an incredibly interesting character, but he's in the midst of this as the curator at the nation's premier museum for these types of collections for many, many years, and he can be a jealous guy. He can be quick-witted, angry, terrifying, rude. And he's also committed beyond all else to the project to collect and organize human remains from around the world. And he observes that people at the Smithsonian are deeply influenced by salvage anthropology and the justification around cultural salvage. But he argues that people don't quite see the value of human remains collections in the same way that they see salvaging other aspects of culture as being inherently valuable. He writes, "If it's urgent to gather data on the language, religion, and customs of people who are disappearing, it is surely quite as urgent to secure a physical record of the same groups, records which will always remain the most substantial criterion of their classification." But Erdlichka is not just himself. He's not capable of traveling quickly enough, despite his best efforts, to collect all of the potentially valuable, rare, and threatened human remains that he sees as these invaluable resources. He just isn't able to be everywhere at once, so he feels like he's missing out on certain types of collections. So I argue, though, that this work really begins many, many decades earlier and lasts for a remarkably long time. Lewis Henry Morgan is an early anthropologist starting work before the Civil War and carrying on through the Civil War, writing some of the earliest published American ethnologies by an American-born author, is encouraging local historical societies to gather materials in Wisconsin and New Mexico from indigenous societies before, again, predictably, these societies might disappear. But that is, probably taking place 40, 50, 60 years before the literature really suggests that this gets going. This is a really remarkable photograph that I think gives you, this is taken in 1911, and it gives you an indication of how large these collections were already becoming. The Smithsonian, at its height, probably possessed a collection of about 35,000 sets of human remains. And the University of Michigan, for example, at one time possessed several thousand sets of human remains. It still holds a fairly substantial collection of human bones. Bones and other materials really become collected in this way on a nearly industrial scale. But at almost every turn, however, this grand vision that was being laid out by the early founders of these collections, specifically those who claimed that the secrets of racial evolution would be laid bare through scientific examination of human bodies, the project just seemed to veer further and further off course. Grave robbing, scientific racism, and ethnocentrism ultimately damaged the reputations of museums and scientists on a global scale, something we're still dealing with today. But the story continued to evolve in ways that are less often recognized in the available literature. And the later part of this story, the sort of epilogue, often centers on repatriation, but it's less fully grappled with how indigenous people are actively utilizing historical museum and archival collections in new art and in new cultural revitalization projects. At around the same time as bone collecting is becoming a phenomenon, and of course stretching up in many respects to the present, these other types of collections are being built in parallel, attempting to offer these fleeting glimpses, right, of apparently threatened societies. This influence is remarkably vast. Anthropologist Margaret Mead writes that salvage anthropology, or efforts to engage in cultural salvage, really inspire her to go out and engage in fieldwork for the first time. But when she visited the Omaha for what she describes as a, quote, infuriating and depressing summer in 1930, she described having encountered a broken culture. And these were no longer the pure or authentic, untouched societies that anthropologists and others had been chasing after when attempting to document human life. Huge amounts of time and energy and even financial resources had been invested into the salvage movement, but the intensity with which it was driven seemed to fade during the Great Depression and Second World War. The movement really appeared to be on life support. Anthropologists in the middle of the 20th century were seeking to ask different questions and looking at different approaches than earlier generations. The story of the Omaha and salvage anthropology is remarkably interesting. They had been the subject of intense scrutiny and study in their own recent history. Let me mention this remarkable anecdote that in the late 19th century, Alice Fletcher, who happened to also have been the first woman to receive a fellowship supporting her research from Harvard University in any discipline, worked closely with Frederick Ward Putnam and the Peabody Museum to gather collections and publish her findings. In the closing years of the 19th century, she coordinated specifically with an Omaha man named Francis LaFlesche, but several Omaha individuals coordinated the gathering and the donation of several of the most spiritually sacred objects belonging to the tribe, which were then gifted to Harvard's Anthropology Museum. Fletcher had been working with several tribes in the Great Plains in this sort of progressive, inspired ethos to implement the Dawes Act, this new federal law intended to break up collectively held Native American reservations onto individual family farms. She believes, influenced by the progressive ethos, that this sort of Protestant, capitalist-oriented mentality of the late 19th and early 20th century. She, I believe, genuinely thinks she's doing the right thing. And when one of the items is stolen in the process of this transfer, she sets out to try to find this. How do you find an object, in this case, a rare and highly sacred albino buffalo hide? How do you find an object that's been stolen in 1899? It's this remarkable question. And what's amazing is that she's able to, after several years, track it down to a dealer in Chicago who claims that he had acquired it in exchange for a bottle of whiskey. The archives, though, suggest that Fletcher had gone with a notary and attorneys to the Omaha Reservation, where she recorded several depositions, notarized depositions that suggest that several individuals within the Omaha tribe agreed with LaFlèche and Fletcher in their rationale to keep these objects together and send them to Harvard's Peabody Museum. And indeed, ultimately, the object is recovered. It turns out threatened with legal action. This guy who claimed to have gotten it legally suddenly had this, change of heart. But Fletcher, too, let me just mention that it's an told part of this story is the gender aspect of the story, and that key early individuals like Frances Densmore and Alice Fletcher are certainly involved prominently, but they often they're frequently denied support for their work as a result of the sexist ethos in the era. But the story really is almost singularly told in connection with one man, in connection with the life and work of Franz Boas and perhaps his contemporaries and his students. Boas was, in fact, this pioneering German-American anthropologist based in New York City, and he does, in fact, have his fingerprints all over the salvage movement. He encourages people to go out and collect for the World's Fair taking place in Chicago, and again, when he becomes a curator at the American Museum of Natural History, he encourages his students to collect from the position at Columbia University, and he really does have a remarkable amount of influence in the story. But his singular influence alone is not enough to fully understand this story and how it becomes so remarkably vast. Many staffers, for example, who are working in the same era as Boas with the BAE, the Bureau of American Ethnology, are deeply influenced by the salvage mentality, but you can't really call them Boasians, as is so often stated in the literature. Another important and lesser known component of the story is the degree to which artists were both influenced and were influenced by the salvage movement. So in this current book project, I seek to explore many of the ways in which drawing, painting, photography, and early film were utilized as tools for the salvage movement. The stories of artists and their rhetorical commitment to preserving fleeting images of these supposedly doomed societies adds another remarkable dimension to the story. It's frequently been argued that these artists and the images that they produce really reinforce certain tropes and symbols connected to Native American society. And this is in fact true, but it's also been more recently considered the degree to which self-fashioning was playing a role in how these images were produced. To what extent did people self-stylize their clothing, poses, what sorts of images were taken or not, and to what extent do we need to see this as these outside individuals with their own ideas about authenticity, for example. So Edward Curtis, a famous photographer who, a remarkable sort of moment or example in the story is that he takes a photograph inside of a Plains Indian teepee, and using, a century prior to Photoshop, a precursor to Photoshop, he wipes away an alarm clock that is present in the teepee because it doesn't look authentic. Earlier, painters like George Catlin traveled a remarkably extensive array across North and South America and created hundreds of, thousands of images altogether, many of which were destroyed in a fire. So I argue that artists both are inspired and influenced by this movement, but in certain remarkable sorts of ways, they inspire trends and other advancements in other arenas as well. For example, Edward Curtis is one of the first photographers to experiment with what we might call ethnographic film. So despite the waxing and waning influence of these collections in American culture, issues surrounding the process of collecting, gathering, researching, and displaying human remains or sacred objects does not represent the sort of simple declension story. These collections, the debates about these collections really emerged anew in the later 20th century. Indigenous people, indigenous activists, lawyers, and scholars have been pushing forward for the return of human remains and sacred materials. That's a story that takes place over several years in the 80s and up to 1990 with the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And really around this era, when you go back and read the newspapers, look in archival documents and so forth, what's really screamingly obvious is the deep level of distrust between Native Americans and museums in this moment. And communications and breakdowns in communications, missed opportunities, those things were really the norm rather than sort of these unfortunate side stories. But even still, Native lawyers, activists, and scholars continued pushing, and the process, and also I think as a result of some really consequential generational shifts and hard work on the part of Native American representatives, tribal delegations, and museum professionals, this story is quite a bit different now than it was in 1995. And this has an even deeper story as well. Let me just mention that starting as far back as the late 1960s, museum archives suggest that even before the emergence of the American Indian movement, protests and resistance started to bubble up in places like upstate New York, for example, resisting the display, the exhibition specifically of objects that were deemed highly sensitive or sacred, especially in episodes where, and in the late 1960s, right, this was profoundly common, where there was zero consultation with Native American communities, very little consultation. By the 1980s, some of these sacred materials were starting to be returned even before the appearance of the new federal law, and in 1990, this new law really changes the game. Some Native American scholars in particular have cautioned me not to suggest to readers that the repatriations that take place before NAGPRA were somehow out of pure goodwill, but rather as a response to constant and ongoing pressure to return the highly sensitive materials to their rightful owners. Museums, some indigenous people began arguing, could not legally or morally defy America's constitutionally protected right to religious freedom. And it makes for this compelling drama, which the media tracked very closely for a time. They were, especially around 1990, 1992, perfectly willing to print the sometimes outlandish sort of Chicken Little predictions offered by museum curators and other scientists that claimed that storehouses of museum collections were about to be emptied by the PC police or whatever. I've never actually seen the PC police anywhere, but people are always afraid of them. So beyond the fears, though, that are represented in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this still is a thread in the scholarly literature and the popular literature, expressed, for example, in a more recent book like Tiffany Jenkins' Keeping Their Marbles, how the treasures of the past ended up in museums and why they should stay there, published in 2016. But again, these collaborations through consultation, it often became clear that certain materials did not belong in these contexts and should in fact be returned to tribes, in many cases to be returned to the ground, sometimes to be held in specifically designed tribal museums, or other sorts of solutions. Sometimes just legal ownership of sensitive objects are transferred to tribes, but museums remain stewards or caregivers, in a sense, for these objects. In the closing chapter of my new book, I intend to explore how Native Americans have been intensely utilizing some of these archives. Working in many cases to decolonize the materials through offering new voice and new presentation and presenting and understanding them in a new way. In recent years, language revitalization efforts have been especially intense amongst indigenous communities across North America, and younger tribal activists especially reach back into archives to gather more instructional material. In the new book, I also anticipate casting an eye towards living Native artists and activists that are working with museum collections to create new types of artistic expression and cultural revitalization programs. And in a new series of oral history interviews that I hope will be made fully available to the public, I plan to ask Native artists to speak to issues directly behind the history of these museum collections or archival collections and how they came to be. Before I reach a more serious conclusion, let me add one additional point. While this is a really serious subject overall with consequential and profound implications for Native people, for museum professionals, and many others, sometimes things take a bizarre and potentially humorous twist, like the guy who explains to the University of Pennsylvania that for his guest lecture, if you could just give me 2 hours and if I could bring a blowgun with me to demonstrate the use of poisoned arrows, that would really make my lecture pop. I asked if I could do the same thing tonight for this, but they politely declined. So I had to leave my blow darts at home. But this bigger picture question really is resonant for me of why do this? Why study the history of museums? Partially, like any study in the historical enterprise, partly it's just interesting. These stories connect remarkable people and often going to far-flung places, and I can't help but wonder what their lives or encounters might have been like. On the other hand, there are profoundly important reasons beyond just mere curiosity to understand these issues. In large part, we study the history of museums to better understand how they might move forward more progressively, more productively into the future, how we might avoid some of the same mistakes of the past or address some of the same mistakes or some of the mistakes that have been made. And indeed, what happens when this sort of reality comes to the fore? How do we move forward when museum history reveals some not so nice things about the history of our institutions or the history of our disciplines? It is often the case that people don't want to hear or engage with these difficult truths or think that this is some sort of thing in the past that no longer happens or matters, therefore. I argue that that couldn't be further from the truth, that it continues to have this lingering and profound impact in how we think about museums, how we think about the relationships between museums and indigenous people, museums and science, and many, many other arenas. Bone collecting, in certain respects, proves to be the ultimate manifestation of the salvage anthropology movement. Human bodies, as part of the natural course of their existence, both physical and cultural, very often decay or are sometimes intentionally destroyed. And even in cases where remains were mummified, naturally mummified in dry caves, people could not have anticipated that this massive project to use bodies as a scientific commodity and then display them in cities from San Francisco to New York, people could not have anticipated that that was going to be the reality. But the story of salvage anthropology is often illustrated as this dramatic rise and gradual fall. But in reality, the movement really just shifts and changes over time rather than really fades out. Historian Henrika Kuklik argued, anthropological salvage persists, although I must stress that it does not necessarily have consistent implications. The image of a people untouched by Euro-American culture excites the imagination of popular audiences. So thinking about Native American materials from the more mundane examples to material culture that is highly charged with spiritual or religious meaning, thinking about these problems has grown a great deal over the course of the last 10 to 20 years. And many of the changes have been the sort of pivot point for many of the changes in the discourse were really connected to the 1990 passage of NAGPRA and the implementation of that, or the problems connected to that over the course of the ensuing decades. And thinking about how to unpack all of this, how to better explain this process has really represented no small task for historians and others who are seeking to better understand this. There are many characters involved, many different types of episodes, and the resulting legacy is profoundly complicated. However, there are some really radical and important changes. US and European museums are gradually becoming more open to the consultation process and shared authority in the development of the care for collections as well as exhibitions. And some museums, including museums on this campus, have been quite successful in developing this dialogic process through which all parties involved can potentially benefit and really get something important out of it. In 2018, the Society for American Archivists endorsed protocols for Native American archival material. that further works to expand this discussion on best practices and the care of these legacy materials that are sometimes collected under challenging, illegal, unethical manners. So how do we deal with, and things like privacy concerns, questions about genetics and Native American DNA are quite prominent even in library and archival settings. So how do we determine what are the right ethical steps forward once we better understand this history? And I want to argue that in fields like conservation and in fields like archives, they're working towards finding some solutions or at least advancing the conversation in how we respond to this sometimes not so nice legacy. But if these now hushed voices could speak directly to the living, perhaps they would simply be intent on reminding us of their existence. They might try to humanize themselves against their portrayal as numbered scientific specimens. Maybe they would push back against the misconception that recent legislation has resolved all of these questions surrounding their position. The story of their collection, study, and exhibition leaves with us a legacy that we must continually confront as we reassess science and society. Museums can serve as key spaces to attempt to come to terms with this colonial legacy attached to archaeology, anthropology, and many other disciplines through partially redressing past wrongs while continuing to search for new knowledge. We, in fact, owe it to the dead to carry on the conversation, as difficult as it may be, in an effort to better understand their legacy and contribution to our living world. Thank you so much. So I think we have a couple of microphones up here, and I would be delighted to hear some questions from the audience. If folks have
them. Thank you for speaking. And I was actually just on a personal level wondering what drew your interest to this subject and why you've made it your area of study.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. So it was a really remarkable journey for me personally. I grew up in southern Minnesota next to a Native American reservation, had a lot of Native American friends, and I knew absolutely nothing about any of these issues until much later. During my first internship at a museum, at the Field Museum, I started to learn that there existed these things, bone rooms, and that they had this fraught history. And then from there, I moved to then the Colorado History Museum, where I participated in a very small way, organizing remains to go home in what was, at the time, the largest repatriation in the history of the country. And there again, it was the type of thing where I was interested in museums and the history of museums, but I couldn't stop thinking about the specific questions that were present with human remains collections. And then I went to go write a dissertation on the history of material culture collecting and exhibiting, and found Army Medical Museum records. And I should put in a rejoinder to that. I just wrote a short article about this too that was published in the History of Anthropology newsletter that I described my method as like deep hanging out in archives. I would just ask people, I'm interested in these things. What else is there that I might look at? And over time, archivists started to mention to me these Army Medical Museum records. This is a brief, funny story. Let me just say, too, I go back to my grad school, and I try to tell my PhD advisor that I want to write not about material culture, but about the history of collecting human remains. And in a span of a 20-minute monologue, he, for the first 10 minutes, told me what a terrible idea that was. Then for 5 minutes said, that might be kind of interesting. Then for the next 5 minutes was like, yeah, you go write that dissertation. So it took some convincing and sort of pushing the project forward, both for myself and for my advisors. But I came to it through museum practice, and then as a historian when I was sort of smacked in the face with these archival worlds.
Thank you. I'd like to hear about the next steps and some of the interesting examples that you've seen of communities actually using the collections that are still in museums and the archives, and how the communities themselves are dealing with the colonial legacy.
That's a great question. So let me deal just briefly with that second question first. There's a great example, just to give you a high-profile, interesting example. The Smithsonian, I believe in about 2009, launched a program called Recovering Voices. And that specifically, there are several components of that where it involves grants program to bring delegations to access these materials and work in consultation with archivists and curators and other experts while they're there. So that's one a prominent example. That's an example a lot of other museums are modeling. But as far as next steps, that is this major question, and I'm curious. There are probably many sort of thoughts and notions in response to that question, even in this room. But I think the answer has to be continuing deepening these relationships, more thoroughly and clearly acknowledging this history in every aspect of the museum process. So not just like a cursory sort of exhibit panel explaining that, but sort of educating museum visitors on how this process has taken place. And then the sort of literature on decolonizing museums is quite interesting and offers many different examples of how we might think of these things quite differently. Let me just give one example that I saw quite recently of the Metropolitan Museum of Art asking Native artists and other thinkers to comment in new exhibit panels, not just on Native art, but on art created by Europeans that depicts Native people. So to create alternative exhibit panels, not removing the original exhibit panel, but adding additional information that could potentially advance the story and enrich people's understanding. So I think those are some ways in which we might continue. Let me just mention, too, a great example that I heard more about today, consultation where students here on this campus are working in capstone projects or creating exhibitions with tribal elders both in the United States and in Canada via Skype, where material objects can be shown via video chat, and Native elders can provide unique and often invaluable insights. And that it wasn't possible even just a few decades ago. Certainly not to the degree to which it's possible now. So I think exploring those opportunities where we can enrich those relationships, even when we can't have those face-to-face interactions, is a valuable next step forward. It's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that.
Over here.
Oh, could you raise your hand? I can't see. Oh, there. Okay.
So I'm wondering if you have any views on the exhibitions of plastinated bodies that have been going around for a while. It was thought that some of those bodies were Chinese prisoners, and it's not just a question of where the bodies come from, but how they're displayed. The whole thing. Do you have views about that?
Yeah. So I wrote an article, a short essay on these exhibitions in some places under the headline, "Why are we still attracted to displays of the human dead?" And what's sort of interesting about that to me is that essay that I published has been read, at least insofar as the analytics suggest of the number of hits, that essay has been read far and away more than anything I've ever written in my entire life. There's a huge interest in the original series of exhibitions called Body Worlds, and then a whole host of exhibitions that are copycat exhibitions. And the copycat exhibitions are especially problematic. They're the ones that have come under the most intense scrutiny, like you're describing, of nefarious collecting practices in China and elsewhere of human remains. And the exhibitions are, they're shot, the way they're marketed is so similar to the original Body Worlds exhibitions. And they're displayed at places without museum accreditation. So places like the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas. I think that there is a lot of really problematic dynamics that are taking place there, to say the least, perhaps unsurprisingly. When looked from a less cynical perspective, perhaps they do work. Many millions of people have visited these exhibitions, and with the original Body Worlds exhibition, they're now on, I think, like the 5th iteration. Like, one was specifically on organs. They've maybe had one specifically on skin, and so forth. So perhaps people are hooked in to the science and understanding biology or anatomy in some way, but I think the problems in many respects outweigh, especially of the copycat exhibitions, the problems vastly outweigh the benefit. But to me, it's just a remarkable sort of phenomenon, again, where there's this discourse about how people are very concerned about this process, and then on the other hand, people visit those exhibitions with remarkable consistency and to a really amazing degree. So yeah, I've thought about them. If people are interested in thinking about that more or reading that essay, I would gladly welcome any sort of response people would have.
So I think our time is up. I want to thank Sam for his talk. And as a token of appreciation, I'd like to give you a copy of a recent book, Object Lessons in the Formation of Knowledge. It's a history of University of Michigan Library Archives and Collections, commissioned for the bicentennial of the university, and edited by Kirsten Barnt and Carla Sinopoli, the recent director of the Museum Studies program.
Looks beautiful too.
So please join me in thanking Sam.
Thank you.